So I have one big question, which I'm going to try to attack because it's an important question to attack. And the question is the sin of Abraham. So this is the question that's been proposed to me, which I'm going to take quite a long time in trying to answer. The question was, Eugene is not trying to excuse Abraham's sin, right, in having concubines, etc., just obedient and faithful to God's calling. We all have known pastors and respected spiritual persons within the church fallen into sexual sins, even justifying them. So this is a very important question, because this understanding Abraham's sin really helps us understand how we read Genesis. One of the main reasons to read Genesis this time is to try to read it as a friend of the Genesis narrator. And the reason we want to do that is because we want the Genesis narrator to change our worldview. We want to learn the Genesis narrator's way of looking at things. So in this, for example, we learned that the blessing of the land, the protection and furtherance of the seed are two of the central themes of the text. The land and the seed, the land and the seed. We have to make sure that the seed marries a relative, or at least someone who's not going to bring them into idolatry, and we have to make sure we stay in the land. And we note that this land and the seed is ultimately fulfilled in Christ. So central is the concept of the land and the seed to Genesis, that faithfulness to God is expressed essentially in the faithfulness to the promises of God in the land and the seed. Faithful are those who believe in God's promises of land and the seed, and they are credited as righteous. Those who leave the land, like Uncle Lot, or like Judah later on, we will see, are considered unfaithful. Those who despise the seed, like Esau, are unfaithful, while those who hold firmly onto God's promises, making an effort to go to and to remain in the land and to protect the seed from Canaanite wives, like Abraham, are declared as faithful. So central is this theme that one wonders if the land and the seed and the faithfulness to it is all that matters. I mean, you could easily read Genesis and think that all that matters is the land and the seed. And somehow the Genesis narrator is condoning or overlooking Abraham's sin. Today we have a worldview where some things we see are sinful and others we see are not, based on our worldview. Now there are some actions in life that both the Genesis narrator and we will see as sinful. I give a very obvious example of child sacrifice. The Genesis narrator abhors child sacrifice, and we, most of us today, also abhor child sacrifice. However, there are many things that we may see as quite innocuous that the Genesis narrator finds very sinful. For example, the overruling of a husband by the wife. I bash on. So, tokenism, the kind of thing that Cain did, is considered extremely sinful in the Genesis narrator, but we don't think too much about it. The reliance of our own strength to become strong, like a Haggiborim, a mighty man. The acquisition of wealth, the reliance of Egypt for chariots and horses, which are some things that we do quite a lot in today's world, we think nothing of, but the Genesis narrator would see these things as sinful. Ignoring the importance of the land and the seed, intermarriage to unbelievers. These things we take for granted today as not being very important, but the Genesis narrator seems to think these are quite sinful. On the other hand, there are things that we find quite unacceptable, that the Genesis narrator seems not too bothered about. Now, this could be cultural difference. For example, having multiple wives or concubines. It seems to me that the Genesis narrator it seems to the Genesis narrator that Abraham and Sarah are the ideal Eden husband and wife. But after 100 years old, after Sarah has died, and after mourning for a very long period for his dead wife Sarah, this perfect Eden husband and wife relationship, Abraham marries again. Now, I think most of us would say it's okay. I mean, if you have any friends who are 130 years old and they were widowed when they were 100 and they're marrying again, I think not many of us would say, oh, you're sinning by marrying again. They would probably have shown their saintly being by living to 130 years. However, we are also told that he had other concubines, and the Genesis narrator seems not bothered by this. And perhaps after you're widowed and after a long marriage, taking on the concubines in that culture may not be as evil as a thing as it is in our culture. Then there are things I think that both we and the Genesis narrator recognize as sinful, but both the Genesis narrator and us recognize these things are human. For example, the matriarch Jeopardy episodes, which occur again and again. The patriarch is in a famine situation. He's desperate. He's ran out of food. He's escaping out of land. He goes to a pagan king and he lies that his wife is his sister. We don't find any strong admonition against this kind of behavior. Indeed, we find the patriarch praying for the pagan king for healing. But perhaps we also understand this today. A good pastor today will not go up to a church member who's just been diagnosed with terminal cancer and scold them for being afraid. You have to understand, when facing a famine, when wandering into a pagan land, it's scary. It's not dissimilar to facing cancer. A good pastor does not rebuke a man who's lost his job and is worried about his income. The narrator seems, like many good pastors today, to understand, and therefore he's not harsh on the matriarch Jeopardy episodes. And perhaps neither should we, because it does take superhuman faith to face up with such threats. The Genesis narrator rarely comments out clearly about what is wrong or sinful. He does in the text, you notice, in Esau's despising of the inheritance, he points it out as wrong. Later on, when Michal, the daughter of Saul, rebukes David's worship as his wife, he also points it out as wrong. But this is rare. The narrator most of the time doesn't comment out loud. He lets us make up our own minds about what is sinful and what is not. What is really sinful, he will point out. But the things that are not so sinful, the narrator leaves it for us to figure out. But the things that are really sinful in the Genesis narrator is unfaithfulness to the promise of the land and the seed. So, what we have to do as we read with the Genesis narrator is to change our minds. We're left with one of two options, really: to continue to believe what we think is sinful as sinful and to ignore the Genesis narrator, or to adopt what the Genesis narrator sees as sinful and to change our minds. And I would suggest to you that the second reading is the purpose of reading Genesis. If we went through the whole of Genesis and we are unchanged in terms of priorities, in terms of how we see God, in terms of how we see sin, we will have not moved very much in this study. Let's, for an exercise, be mean to Father Abraham and count out his sins. Now, I can count 8 sins. If anybody picks out any others, you can tell me. Number 1, he waited in Haran, not going to the promised land immediately, chapter 11, verse 31. Number 2, there was the first matriarch Jeopardy episodes, chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. Number 3, he complained he was childless. But me and Walkie both don't think this is a sin. We think complaint can be a part of faithfulness, having faith, 15:2. He sleeps with Hagar, 16:4, and has a child by her. He laughs as the promised son, 17:17. And the second matriarch Jeopardy episode with Abimelech, chapter 20, verses 1 to 10. He's distressed about sending Ishmael away, chapter 21, verses 11. And he has concubine in his old age, chapter 25, verse 6. These are the 8 sins we have. I hope as we look at this list of sins, we might come to the same conclusions as the New Testament authors of the Hebrew and the Apostle Paul come to. They come to the conclusion that Abraham is a father of faith. And there's no mention of any of these sins in the New Testament. Indeed, this is a problem I had when I first started reading the Old Testament. When I became a Christian almost 30 plus years ago, I read the New Testament and I saw this glowing recommendation and report card for Abraham. And then when I went back to the Old Testament, I read, and I find this guy's laughing at the promise. He's having sex with Hagar. I said, what is this? The New Testament's got it wrong. Abraham is not that faithful person. He wavers and withers and quivers. And so I struggle with it too. But now with 31 years of scripture reading behind me, I come to realize that really a lot of these sins that Abraham have are not that much of a quibble or that much of a failure of faith. So number one, he waited in Haran, but now I'm beginning to see he waits in Haran because he wants to obey his father. The father is the head of the household. And I think in the Genesis narrator's mind, obedience to the head of the household is more righteous than bashing away with disobedience, even if that disobedience is in accordance with God's will. He gives a contrasting example, which is Rebekah, who bashes away at making Jacob blessed against the head of the household, although that is God's will. And he definitely condemns Rebekah for doing it, but he doesn't condemn Abraham. So I would say sin one is not a sin. Sometimes in life, we're faced with two opposing wrong decisions: to disobey your father and leave him alone to follow God's will, or to follow God, or not to follow God's will and delay it and stay with your father. It's not a simple yes or right, black or white. And in this case, I find the Genesis narrator is on the side of Abraham. He allows Abraham to honor his father until his death before following God's will. So I would say sin one, not a sin. Matriarch Jebediah. Of course, it's wrong to lie, but you got to understand, lying is not really what it seems in this passage. Abraham told a semi-truth. I mean, she is kind of his sister, his half-sister, out of great fear for his life. But lying to save your life when you're facing an opposing pagan king is not really seen as a sin. As we read through the rest of the narrative that the Genesis narrator has written, we realize that this is not a sin at all. In 1 Samuel 21, David lies and says he's mad. He pretends to be a madman to escape his enemies killing him. This is not seen as a sin. This is seen as a military tactic. When we play chess and we pretend to chase after a pawn when we in fact is revealing a bishop to get your queen, is that a sin? It's not, because we are playing chess. That revealing the queen revealing the bishop to get your queen by moving the pawn forward to seem to attack another piece is strategy. And similarly, when David does military strategy, he may not be honest. After all, we sometimes mistakenly think that the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not lie. But in fact, it is thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. You're not to put your neighbor in jail by telling something that's wrong and getting him in trouble, not lying per se. But it seems to me that the Genesis narrator has a much better grasp of real world functions. That in the real world, things don't function simply as lies and not lies, truths and not truths. Indeed, we find at times God seems to lie. When we come to Exodus, God seems to lie to allow the Egyptians to think that the Israelites are lost in the desert. God seems to lie when he tells Pharaoh that the people are going to go out just to worship and come back to you. But these are not lies, these are military tactics. So I think that Matriarch Jebediah does reveal a lack of faith to a degree. It's not an outrageous lack of faith after all. Who would have thought God can control the pagan king's dreams? The whole point of the passage is to tell you how great God is, that he can control pagan king's dreams. So it's not an outrageous lack of faith. Ultimately, what Abraham did in the matriarch episodes cannot be commended, but it does not fall into sin as the Genesis narrator understands it. Otherwise, he would not be the one blessing Abimelech. After all, have we not been reading, will not the God of justice do right? The recurrent refrain in Genesis is the God of justice will do right. How can then Abraham bless Abimelech if he's the one in sin? So I think sin number 2 and 6 are invalid. Sin 3, I've already argued along with Walke that complaint is not incompatible with faith. So we're left with sin 4 and 5, the laughing at the promise and the sleeping with Hagar. As we read these episodes, we find that the narrator is not admonishing Abraham for these acts, but the narrator is trying to show you how ridiculous this promise of God is, how outrageous it is for a 100-year-old man to have a child. When we read the text, we know the ending. Isaac is born. But when Abraham walks through this text, he doesn't know that. So laughing and helping God along by taking on Hagar is not really such an outrageous act of unbelief. He has sex to help God along. He laughs at God's plan because it's an incredulous promise. And that's the point. The backbone of the promise of Isaac is that it's an impossible promise to believe. And therefore, when he laughs at it and when he tries to help God along, you can't see that as a sin. If you were 100 years old and God promised you this, would you not laugh? Surely you would laugh. Sin 7, distress about Ishmael's leaving. Now we have to remember, Ishmael is Abraham's son. And I think any normal loving father would be distressed that his son is leaving to die in the desert. I think it would be a sin not to be distressed if your son is leaving to the desert to die. So again, I do not see this as a sin. So we're left with no solid sin that I can take to Abraham's head with a gun, apart from this concubine in the old age. But this is also problematic because for modern day Christians, we understand concubine as quite different from what a concubine was in Abraham's time. Taking on a concubine is quite common in the Deuteronomistic narrative. Concubines is not about sex. In fact, we have an example of a concubine not having sex. Abishag for David in 1 Kings 1. She was taken as a concubine to keep him warm because he's feeling cold all the time. I think he probably has hypothyroid. He sounds like a hypothyroid guy in 1 Kings, but I'll get to that when we study 1 Kings in the future. But it was very clear that David didn't have sex with Abishag. Concubines was far more than somebody to have sex with. Concubines was a way to provide more heirs and more workforce. And sometimes concubines are there so that the patriarch can provide for protection for the concubine. It was common for people who are rich to take on concubines, especially after their primary wife has died. And in their old age, if they need looking after, 1 Kings 1. Or their children have grown old and their children can no longer work on the ground, so they need more children to work the land. So that's why they take on concubines. The alternative to concubine, if you think about it, in that age is to take on slaves, which is worse. So I think there is very little hint that the Genesis narrator frowns on Abraham's concubine taking, remembering that Abraham has had his Eden perfect marriage and has been widowed for 30 years before he took on any concubine. And the concubine, at least the name concubine, is a Hebrew concubine. He has a Hebrew name, Keturah. So he's not taking on foreign wives. I think taking on a concubine is not so much sinful as what a man does with the concubine. So in 1 Kings 1, Abishag, going with David's concubine, is there to demonstrate in the story David's impotence, that he can't have sex with the concubine. And the impotence is not only over Abishag, it's over his son. He cannot control his sons. And his sons are now fighting for the throne. In Judges 19, the unfaithful separated concubine from the Levite is sent out of the house to be mass raped in a repeat Lot incidents. And this is obviously a story that tells you the husband is very sinful. He throws out the wife, and the concubine is no better either. But this story tells you the sin of the Levite. In 1 Kings 11, the many concubines of Solomon, I quote, turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and the Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. This is the problem. He took concubines, and the concubine led him into sin. Concubine has the ability to lead you into sin, but the taking on a concubine by itself seems to be fairly neutral. So in Abraham's case, I really find very little solid admonition for sin by the Genesis narrator. In contrast, he seems to be able to send away his concubines, presumably generously, because we know he's a generous person, and protect the faithful seed and the land. I think today we have a Christian phobia of sexual sin, which is probably a reaction to the sexual revolution and the hippie movement in the 1960s. The Bible has quite a concrete view. I think the Bible has quite a healthy view of sex. Gordon Fee used to say, sex within the confine of the marriage is not a sin, it's something to be rejoiced in and celebrated by the hosts of heaven. After 70-year marriage to a woman he loves, after 20-year plus of widowhood, in the aging Abraham, taking concubine to increase his workforce, his household, and sending them generously, is that a sin? I don't know. I don't see the Genesis narrator making much of it, so I don't know. But I do know that he clings onto the promise of God. So what about us? When we read Genesis, do we cling on to our beliefs of what is right and wrong, what is sin and what is righteous, or do we listen to the Genesis narrator? And if we listen, what have we learned? Maybe we learned that Abraham's sin is, Brother Eugene is excusing his sin and fostering sexually impure pastors in the church. But maybe we might learn what the New Testament authors learned, which is Abraham believed in God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That in fact, none of this matters. That the New Testament conclusion that they come to is, we all sin, even Abraham sinned. But our righteousness does not come from us avoiding sin. Our righteousness comes when we believe in God. And we are credited, we're given the grace to be forgiven. Okay, so with that, I'm going to come into the main text of today. We're picking up the text from chapter 28, and this is the bulk text of Jacob. I'm going to skip a little bit to try to keep on time, so I presume you have read it. If you haven't, do read the passage fully after. So here, Isaac calls, you remember he's blessed Jacob by deception, and he can't bless Esau. He can only give the curses to Esau, and then Esau is frustrated, and Isaac is have to go away because Esau is going to murder Isaac. No, not Isaac. I mean Jacob has to go away because Esau is going to murder Jacob. So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. He says, "Do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel." So that is where Laban is. That's where Rebekah came from. So he wants him to go there. "May God bless you and make you fruitful in numbers, increase in numbers." This is the same blessing, give you descendants, same blessing Abraham that Isaac has. "You may take possession of land," same blessing. So Isaac went on, sent Jacob on the way. Then to Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean. Now, why does he go to an Aramean? And that's because it's not that Arameans have the same faith as the Israelites. No, but Aramean wives, they are better wives. They are better wives in that they do not persuade the husband to join their religion. Canaanite wives, when they marry to you, will persuade you to join their religion. Aramean wives follow their husband's religion, and we will see later on they don't follow it very well, as we can see with Rebekah and later with Rachel. But nonetheless, that's why he sends him to Aramean wives. Now, Esau learned that Isaac has blessed Jacob and sent him to take a wife from Padan Aram, commanding him not to marry a Canaanite woman. And now, Esau realized how displeasing this Canaanite woman, the two that he's already married, were to his father Isaac. So he went to Ishmael and married Mahalath. This text is very subtle. First, Rebekah has always being distraught about Esau's Canaanite wives. But Esau doesn't like Rebekah. Remember, Rebekah gangs up with Jacob. He's the favorite mother, favorite son. Esau only cares about the father, favorite son. Okay? So it was when he hears that Isaac is also concerned about Jacob getting a non-Canaanite wife that he realizes his mistake. And he tries to correct this mistake by marrying Mahalath. But what is Mahalath? Mahalath is a daughter of Ishmael. What is Ishmael? Ishmael is the son of the slave woman Hagar. They are not part of the seed. They are outside tribes. It's amazing this, because it tells us that Esau, he wants to please his father, but he has absolutely no spiritual insight. In fact, if you were to ask me to put a single feature of Esau, he has no spiritual insight. He has no insight about the value of the birthright, and he sells it for a bowl of red stuff. He has no spiritual insight into the value of his blessing, and therefore he is going there hunting game while it's stolen from him. He has no understanding of the fact that his father has blessed his brother and he cannot bless him the same. And now he has no spiritual understanding of even marrying wives. The seed, the land means nothing to him. He doesn't understand it at all. It's a harsh warning for us as Christians. It's a harsh warning that we may not be blind and not understand what is important in God's eye. That by reading the Genesis text along with the Genesis narrator, that our friendship with this narrator may change us so that we see what is important in the Lord's eyes and we may not be blind like Esau. Verse 10, Jacob says to Beersheba and to Haran. Now, Haran is an interesting place. You remember, Haran is where Abraham got stuck. Now, this is bad because he's left his family, but he doesn't have his family, unlike Abraham. When he gets to Haran, he's stuck. What he calls Haran, a place between a death camp and a prison camp. It's a prison camp because that's where Father Abraham was trapped for many, many years. It's a death camp because he's under threat from Esau. And so he gets to this place where he's by himself. He's in a death camp of a place. He reached a certain place. Now the narrator is beginning to do what he does very well. And now we know him as a good friend. We know what he's doing. He's doing scenic depiction. We're going to be told later on in this passage that this place is called Luz. So it's not a nameless place, but he calls it a nameless place in order to set up the scene that this place is nowhere. That poor old Jacob is now come to a place he's stuck in that is nowhere. He's got nowhere to go. And it's nighttime. Nighttime is always a scene for bad things to happen. You remember Abraham's nighttime nightmare about the 430 years that the Israelites are going to be tortured in Egypt. So this is the scenic depiction, the setting of the sun. At the end of this passage, there's a rising of the sun as Jacob wrestles with God, which is going to reverse the scenic depiction down here. Taking one of the stones there, he puts it under his head. The Hebrew here is not under his head, it's near his head. That's significant. I don't think Jacob was using the stone as a pillar. The stone is near his head because the stone is the source of the dream. And that is why later on the stone becomes the cornerstone of the pillar of worship, as we understand these dreams and we'll see its significance. They lays down to sleep and he saw a stairway that reaches from earth to heaven where the angels of God are ascending above it through the Lord. So this is a stairway that connects earth to heaven. This is the axis of connection between heaven and earth. Jesus, of course, is this axis that connects God to man. The temple functions as this axis that connects God to man. But here, in a pre-temple type, he sees the stairway. And that's why he calls this place Bethel, the house of God, the gate of God. This account begins with this vision of angels, and it ends also with a vision of an angel. And these two ends and beginning of the vision of the angel bookmarks the section of the narrative. Above it speaks the Lord. The Lord says he's the God of Abraham and Isaac. He again promises the same thing, giving of the land, the descendants being the dust spread out to the east, and you'll be blessed through wherever you go. I'll bring you to this land I've promised you. The same themes that's been promised to Abraham, to Isaac. These are the important things of the Genesis narrator, the land, the seed, important things. And we just had the contrast of Esau not getting the importance of these things. Jacob waits and says, this is the place of God. How awesome is this place? This is the house of God. So he took the stone next to his head, and puts it into a pillar and pour oil on it to make a pillar, a stone pillar. So stone is very important in this narrative. We notice stone appears a lot in the Jacob narrative. Of course, stone appears a lot in the Old Testament. There's the stone from which the water came out of to water the people of Israel in the desert when Moses was taking them around. It's very important, the stone. And the stone becomes, of course, in the New Testament, the cornerstone. Jesus Christ, the cornerstone in which the temple, the now temple, is built in, and we are also stones in this temple of God. So this type can be seen through Scripture. He calls the place Bethel, and we're told, of course, it's called Luz, so it does have a name here. So there's a big change, can you see? Jacob goes from this person who's by himself, afraid, fearful, locked in Haran, the place of nowhere, at nighttime, to this person who wakes up worshiping God, putting in a pillar. There's another altar moment. He makes a vow with God that he will give him a tenth. So there's this question I'm going to pick up here. Is the stone a type of Christ? Now I'm going to answer this because I know if I don't, Ken is going to ask me endlessly about this. So there are a lot of types in the Old Testament. We see a lot of things that you will say, oh, that's Christ in the Old Testament. But when I'm teaching, I'm very careful. Sometimes the New Testament authors will tell you a type in the Old Testament of Christ. So like Jesus, he says, if you tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And John makes it very clear he's talking about his body. So we know Jesus is a type of the temple. Very clear. And I'm very happy to preach that. That's why I'm very happy to say he's the cornerstone. But is Jesus this stone next to Jacob's head? Is he the stone in the desert where Moses struck? No, I don't think there's no New Testament witness to that. And so I'm not happy to make that witness either when I'm teaching. But recently I've been reading a Daniel Block's commentary on Deuteronomy, as one does, And Daniel Block makes a very good point. He says, all of these types, really, the ones that are already mentioned in the New Testament, all fine and well. But why are we digging out more types when the ultimate type has already been given? When Thomas puts his hand into Jesus' side and his palm, he declares him, my Lord and my God. When Paul writes in Philippians, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess. What are they confessing to? They're confessing to one truth. When Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am. What is he confessing to? He's confessing to that he is God. And in fact, what Jesus is saying is that every time you see this word Yahweh in the Old Testament, that is Jesus. He is God. He's not the stone here. He's the God that speaks through the stone. He's not the stone in the desert. He's the God that puts water out of the stone in the desert. The ultimate type of Christ is God, is Yahweh. And so the rest of the types of Christ are a little bit redundant when you think about it that way. So anyway, this is a very new idea. I was only reading the commentary yesterday morning, but it adds to my thinking on the stone as a type of Christ. But let's press on. So now we have another chiastic structure passage. I'm not going to bring out the chiastic, but only to tell you that in the center of this chiastic passage are the 12 sons of Jacob, because these are central. These becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. But in the 12 sons of Jacob, we're going to see the great theme in that passage is the rivalry between the wives. So Jacob goes on and he finds a stone over a well, and some shepherds are there. And he says, where are you from? And they say they are Haran. And he asks, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? And he says, yes. Is he well? And he says, oh, there is his daughter Rachel coming with him. And so he said, the sun is still high. It's time, not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture. They say they can't. They can't water the flocks until the stone has been rolled away from the mouth, but then can water the sheep. Now, the reason is that is a very big stone. And they can't water the sheep because they can't take the stone out if there's only one of them or two of them. It takes three of them and probably four of them if you include Rachel. So they put the stone over the well to stop the water from evaporating so that the well doesn't dry out. But they need to take the stone off to water, and it's a big stone. Here, of course, you see that it takes 4 shepherds, and that's why they got to wait for all the shepherds to arrive with all the flocks before they can take the stone out and then water them. While they were still talking, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. And Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and he went over and rolled the stone. This shows how strong Jacob is. Remember, early on, we saw the phrase content describing him in the IV, the word Tom. And we think that he's a nerdy chess player, but it's not. Jacob is giant. He's huge. He can move a stone that takes 4 men to move. And the word Tom means blameless. Doesn't really reflect the size of the person. This story, before we get into this story, is a story of halves. This is from Walke's commentary. Jacob gets to meet Rachel, a woman that he loves deeply, but he's deceived to marry Leah. So he gets half the marriage. He falls in love and it turns sour because his deceit of Esau and his father Isaac turns out now, ironically, that he is deceived by Laban by getting Leah instead of Rachel. The narrative is half lies. Leah has half a lie. She has all the children, but yes, she does not have the love of her husband. And Rachel has half a life. She has all the love of her husband, but she has no children. There's happiness, there's blocked by hostility with one another, there's rivalry, and there's pain in her. And in all of these people with half lives, some working very hard, some being unloved, some being infertile, the Bible passage, the narrative, offers only God's remembrance. God remembers those with half lives. God remembers the unloved, the infertile, the deceived, the hurting, the widow, the grief. And God comes to their rescue. I think that's the message of this passage. If the Abraham story tells of God's providence, the Jacob story tells of God's rescue. Right? God comes to those with broken and half lives. So some of you in this COVID area, you might be struggling with half life, whether it's an unbelieving parent or whether it's a grieving loss or whether it's disease in yourself or your family. God is the God who remembers those in half lives. So now we have another stone, the rock on this. So I say, Jacob, his story is filled with stones, but he has a superhuman strength and he puts it out. And then he kissed Rachel. Now here, in case some of you are romantic and you're thinking of this Casablanca movie kiss, this is not that kind of kiss, okay? So it's quite common for people to greet each other with a kiss. You can think of the Israelites like the French. The French, they kiss, kiss, kiss. Men meet a man, they kiss each other. Men meet a woman, they kiss each other. Woman meets a woman, they kiss each other. They always kiss. Italians are also like that. So too the Israelites. So if you met your relative, you would kiss them anyway. It's not a romantic kiss. But we notice quite something, that obviously this is another woman by the well narrative. And I've said this before, you know, there are 3 women by the well narrative. Abraham's servant with Rebecca, Jacob here with Rachel, and of course Moses with Zipporah. The 4th one, of course, is Jesus with the Samaritan woman by the well, and we begin to see the relevance of how that ties up in Scripture. But here, we're supposed to contrast this with the Rebecca and Abraham's servant woman by the well narrative, because they're both women by the well narrative right next to each other, really, quite near in the same book. While Abraham's servant was looking for hospitality, Jacob is looking for beauty. So that's a clear difference. So they go and tell Laban, and Laban embraced and kissed him. You see, normal. Man kiss man. They're French or Israelites. You're my own flesh and blood. And they stayed with them. They stayed with them. And Jacob stayed with them for 1 whole month. And Laban said to him, just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. This is brilliant, this Laban character. I mean, by the end of this, you're going to get as frustrated as I am about him, annoyed with him. He lets him work for a month before he says, oh, maybe I should offer you some pay. He probably pays the rest of his servants on the 31st day of the month. And it's now the first day of the next month. And he says, oh, maybe I should pay you next month. Let's forget about last month. He's such a greedy guy. Now, Laban has 2 daughters. The elder was Leah, and the younger was Rachel. Leah has weak eyes, and Rachel has lovely figure. It's beautiful. I love the way the Genesis narrator plays out these lines. I mean, it's insulting and praiseworthy at the same line. I mean, he tells it just as it is. Esau was hairy, and Jacob was Tom. And here, obviously, we're supposed to pick up this parallel, okay? We're supposed to hear the poetry and the language. Esau was hairy, Jacob was Tom. Leah had weak eyes, Rachel had lovely figure, was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel. I'll work for 7 years. Stay here with me, because he loved him so much, it seemed only like a few days to him. Oh, amazing, isn't it? My time has come, give her to my wife. So Laban brought together all the people and gave a feast. Now, the word for feast here is mistek, and it's actually not only a feast. It's a great party. It's a party where people drink and got drunk. And I'm sure Laban was there pushing drink upon drink on Jacob, trusting that he's not going to recognize that he's going to be going to bed with Leah and not Rachel. And that's exactly what he did. He got Leah to sleep with Laban and to sleep with Jacob. And when Jacob wakes up, he says, what is it you've done to me? I served you for Rachel tonight. Why have you deceived me? The Hebrew here is beautiful. I served you is the word ahab. Ahab is slave. I slaved for you, literally, for Rachel. Why have you deceived me? And the word deceive is rimitar, and that's exactly the word Isaac used when he discovered that Jacob deceived him. So you're supposed to pick up the irony of this passage, that the deceiver is himself deceived for 7 years of labor and got married to a woman with weak eyes instead of the beauty that he loves. But it's really quite bad, isn't it? Because Laban is gaining slave labor, but he's trading it with his blood relative. He's trading his daughter for slave labor. He's pushing a daughter that's not going to be loved onto a man to get free labor. And he's pushing the other daughter next to get more free labor. So he says, this is not our custom here to give the younger daughter. Finish this bridal week, then I'll give you the younger one also for another 7 years of work. The nerve of this guy. I mean, come on. You promised 7 years for this daughter. You give another daughter. It's like, I promised to sell you a Mercedes. I give you a Mini or a CV, a 2CV. And then I say, pay me another 7 grand for the Mercedes. It's nuts. But what is even more nuts, he says, finish this bridal week. So he set up a bridal week, a week of celebration for Rachel, supposedly. And he's bought all the food, he set up all the entertainers, he bought all the wine, and it's going to go off and he doesn't go. So can you imagine, here is poor Jacob, finding out he's married to the girl he doesn't want to be married with. And now he has to go through 7 more nights of partying with this girl as his pretend wife on his arm that he doesn't like, that he's conned out of without approaching Rachel. He must be mad. But you see the greed. Why does he want to force Jacob to finish the bridal week? He doesn't want to waste the stuff. He's so stingy, this Laban. And so Jacob did. After the week, he got Rachel. And Zilpah given to Leah, and Bilhah given to Rachel, the two maidservants, and he made love to Rachel also. We note here that Isaac and Rebekah's marriage was a marriage made in heaven. It was a marriage built on prayer. It was a marriage built on the faith of Abraham's servant. It was a marriage built on Abraham's servant's observant of hospitality. Here, instead of hospitality, Jacob demonstrates strength. And here, instead of prayer, he uses his brute strength and labor, enslaved labor, to gain the wife. But here is favoritism and rivalry that is reminded in the Jacob-Esau narrative that's at play here. And we get that at the end, he avowed, he prayed for Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive. But Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. He named him Reuben, for he said, "It's because the Lord has seen my mystery, surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she says, "Because the Lord has heard that I'm not loved, I call him Simeon." She conceived again. She gave birth to a son. "Now my husband must be attached to me. I have 3 sons." She called him Levi. She conceived again. She gave birth to a son. "This time I'll praise the Lord." He called him Judah. Then she stopped having children. Very interesting passage, right? What we learned is that in spite of this unprayerful, rivalrous relationship, God still blesses them with children. And God blesses Leah first. God sees that Leah is not loved, and so he steps in to this person with the half-life, with the husband that has no love, and gives her children. The first, Leah thinks that by having children, she's going to be loved, and it turns out not to be so. Then she says, because she's not loved, she got more children. It's the way the Lord deals with her. And then she says, maybe the husband's going to attach to me even if she doesn't love me because I have 3 sons, but that doesn't work either. So finally, it's almost like she gives up and says, oh, I'm just going to praise God now because I've had enough of this. My husband's never going to love me. 3 of the 4 children are named after the way God deals with her. Finally, it's the way she responds to God. She is praising God. And this is very generous. 4 sons given to the wife who's unloved. And more importantly, the 4th son is the carrier of the holy seed. So when Rachel sees that she's not bearing any children, she became jealous of her sister, and she goes to Jacob and says, "Give me children or I die." Jacob became very angry with her and said, "Am I in place of God who has kept you from having children?" Now you get the same rivalry between these 2 sisters as the rivalry between Jacob and Esau. So we see how the narrative plays from generation to generation. But it's also, there's a play in the same way of theology. Rachel goes to Jacob and says, "Give me children." In Rachel's theology, Jacob is lazy. He's not putting in the hard work in the bedroom, and that's why she's not pregnant. "Give me children is all your fault. You're falling asleep every night. You drink too much wine and you're not doing the business enough times at the right time of the month." But Jacob knows the reality that it is God who keeps her from having children. Here we see the vast divide between Rachel, the Aramean, and Jacob, the Israelite. The one who is willing not to force her husband into her faith, but really doesn't get it. He doesn't get that it's God. So he gives up her husband for children. Here is Bilhah, my servant, sleep with her. That's giving up your husband. If you give your servant to your husband to sleep, that's giving up your husband. Giving up the sexual intimacy with your husband. Because she wants to win, she wants to have children. So Jacob slept with her, and she has a son, and he calls him Dan. God has vindicated me, Dan. And has another son, and he calls Naphtali. With great struggle against my sister, I have won. Then Leah saw that she's having children, so he gets Silpah to Jacob and he says, have a son. And names him Gad. What good fortune. And he has another son, Asher. How happy I am. The woman will call me happy. Now, these seem to be very happy names. Gad and Asher, happy, and what good fortune. But you know what these names are? These names are swords. The swords of these two sisters which are using to poke each other. I mean, come on. You call him Dan. God has vindicated me against my sister. You call him Naphtali. I've won. You've lost, loser. And he calls him, what good fortune, Gad. And Asher, I'm happy. These are not happy names. These are swords. They're terrible. They're terrible rivals. During the wheat harvest, Reuben went out to the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. And she said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take away my son's mandrakes too? Very well, he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. Now, for those who don't know, it doesn't make much sense until you realize that the mandrake plant is an aphrodisiac drug, or they thought it was. So Reuben, the eldest son, goes and finds this aphrodisiac plant so that his mother can make some mandrake tea for Jacob. Because Jacob now is a bit tired. You know, Jacob has 4 women to look after. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. He's rotating between Silpah, Bilhah, Leah, and Rachel. He's getting a bit exhausted. So to get him to get his engine going, Reuben gets his mother this aphrodisiac mandrake plants. Now, Rachel sees this, and Rachel also realized Jacob's engine is not revving as quickly as it used to be, and says, well, give me some of your son's mandrake. And so she retorts her, wasn't it enough you took my husband, you take my son's mandrake too? So again, Rachel trades her husband again. First time to Silpah, now to Leah. Okay, I'm going to give you a night. So I'm not kidding when I say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So probably what Jacob did was Monday was Leah, Tuesday with Rachel, Wednesday with Bilhah, Thursday with Silpah, Friday with Rachel, and Saturday with Leah, and Sunday is Sabbath. Oh, well, not Sunday, I mean Friday is Sabbath, but you know what I mean. So once again, Rachel trades a night with the husband for Leah. And Leah comes, you must sleep with me. I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he slept with him and she bore a 5th son. And she says, God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband. So she named him Issachar. So here's a little play on the Hebrew word. The word rewarded is Natan Sakari. And the Sakari comes from, which means hired wages. So these are double words, hired wages. And the hired wages, Sakari, is the same root as Sakar, which is Issachar, which means a man for hire. It's the root for hire. So the play on the word God has rewarded me, the wage, the hired wages for me, and I call him the hired man. Hired is Sakar. Then Leah conceived a 6th son, and God is presented with this precious gift. Again, a 2-letter word, Zabadani Zabed, a precious gift. Again, playing back onto the Natan Sakari. And what Zabadani Zabed means is that endowed me with a dowry. So now, by this child, by the 6th child, she believes that she's now endowed as a proper lawful wife. And so she names him Zebulun, which means honor. Also the same root as Zebed. You see how the Hebrew plays? It's very nice. Sorry, I'm going to unnecessary Hebrew detail, but you see how the Hebrew text plays on itself by these 2 sons. And then she gives birth to Dinah. Okay, so then God listened to her. God remembered her. God remembering is very important. We pick this up. You remember the central part of the Noah narrative is chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah. We know in Exodus, God remembered Israel in Egypt. So it is God's remembrance of Rachel rather than the mandrake plant that makes Rachel fertile. And the whole point is, all through this story, Rachel thinks it's Jacob's fault. Jacob's not working hard enough in the bedroom. He thinks it's Jacob's passion. He's not taking enough mandrake tea. That's why it's not working. He thinks of all these things when the reality is God hasn't remembered her. So it is God's remembrance that allows her to become pregnant. And she says, God has taken away my disgrace. And she named him Joseph. Joseph means he will add to me. May the Lord add to me another son. So here's a play on the word, because the word remove is asap and another is ahir. As we follow the story on, we know what happens. Joseph is removed from Rachel because Joseph is sold into Egypt by his brothers. And he is replaced by another son, Ahir, who is Benjamin. And Benjamin is replaced when Rachel dies and gives birth to Benjamin. So this is another play on the words. It reflects the two plays on words that Leah had with the last two children. And these are the last two children of Rachel, of course. And the play on the words here plays out the story that's going to lead us into Exodus, because Joseph is going to be sold, removed, and Asap is going to be Ahir, replaced by Benjamin. But as I say, the core of this message, I think, is God champions the unloved and the needy. He comes to those who have half lives. And that's important for us to understand. After Rachel gives birth to Joseph, then Jacob says, let's leave. Now, the reason is Rachel is the one he loves. He doesn't love Leah at all. And so he wants to, now that if he left before Rachel had a son, he's afraid Rachel won't go with him. Now Rachel has a son, she has to go with him. So he's going to leave Laban. But Laban says, no, please don't go. I want more free labor. Name your wages. So Jacob says to him how hard he works, how greatly he has suffered, and how much that Laban's been blessed. And so he says, what do you want? What is your wages? He says this, let me go through your flocks and remove every speckled sheep and spotted goats. Now, usually speckled sheep and spotted goats are about 20% of the flock. So he's getting about 20% of the profits. That will be his wages. Anything that's not speckled or spotted, you can consider stolen. So they agree. Obviously, Laban is greedy. He agrees to this. But notice how greedy this man is. That same day, he removed all the male goats that were streaked and spotted, all the speckled spotted female, all the dark colored lambs. He placed them in his care of his son, and he puts a 3-day journey. So not only does he take away all the speckled and spotted so that Jacob won't get anything out of this deal, he picks a 3-day journey so that they won't mate, that there won't be any genes, spotted genes that go down the line towards Jacob. So he's giving a bum deal. But Jacob also has a trick up his sleeve. He cuts some fresh branches and put it in both the water trough. The fresh branches is so that when the female goes to drink water, she has to struggle to get between the branches to get the water. So she's going to be there for a long time, which exposes her rear end to mating from the male. So that's the plan. And he separated the weak and strong, and he separated the colored and streak and non-colored and streak, so that the sex will happen the most between the colored and the strong animals. So he became exceedingly prosperous while Laban got all the weak animals. So here is already a hint that Jacob is getting more and more rich. And this is the reflection of Israel. Jacob then heard that Laban's son was saying, Jacob has taken everything his father owned and gained his wealth belonging to his father. And Jacob noticed Laban's attitude towards him was not what it had been. Okay, it had been greedy and ruthless and cheating. Now it's hostile. There's a parallel to the Exodus, you understand here. Jacob is going to end up plundering Laban, taking all the prosperity out, just like Israel plundered Egypt when they left. But there's also a change of Laban becoming like Pharaoh, becoming someone who wouldn't let him go. So there's a type for Pharaoh here. Then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers, I'll be with you. So he goes. And then he has this conversation with Rachel and Leah. He says, your father's attitude has changed. You know how I work for your father, but your father has cheated me. But God has taken your father's livestock and given to me. Now Jacob refuses God's plan to bless him, and it's not his plan. Jacob is a theologian. He's very clear on why Rachel doesn't get pregnant. He's very clear on why he's being prosperous. It's all around God. And this is one of the central messages of the Genesis narrator. It's everything that happens in our life. Are we clear that this is happening because of God, or are we like Rachel? Are we like Laban? Now he then reveals that in a dream, the angel of the Lord tells him to take the streak and speckled goats, and that's how he's going to make him prosperous. And then Rachel and Leah now suddenly replies, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, he has used up what he's paid for us. So all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us. So here, the daughters finally clue in to what a ruthless, horrible, greedy, selfish, mean father they have. Basically, the elder daughter has been sold into a loveless marriage for 7 years of free labor, and the younger daughter is sold off again for a further 7 years for free labor, and he cheats this person. And not only that, he hasn't given any of this labor money back to the children, the daughters. He spent it all. The word took away, hisso, is the same word that's used later on when the Egyptians are plundered by Israel. So he takes and he goes away. But we note here a little phrase, Rachel stole her father's household god. So she steals the god for what? For protection. So this is a sign how far Rachel is from Jacob's theology and Jacob's faith. There's a little play on words here again, because when Jacob deceived Laban and leaves, the Hebrew is vayignob, and Rachel, who steals the household god, is vatignob, the same root word, both mean steal. So it's this work of the Hebrew words help us see how Jacob and Rachel begin to work together now. And he fled to Gilead. And Laban, of course, catch him up. But God warns Laban in night not to say anything good or bad to Jacob, because God is on the side of Jacob. So Laban comes to Jacob and says, what have you done? Incidentally, that's exactly the same Hebrew phrase that occurs in 29:25 when Jacob realizes he's married Leah and not Rachel, and says, Laban, what have you done? The irony continues. One generation cheats another generation, and one person cheats another. The cheating goes back and forth. What have you done? You carried my daughters in captive. I would have sent you away with singing to music, but you didn't let me kiss my grandchildren goodbye. So he says, I was afraid that you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find any ones who've taken your gods, you'll know. So basically, Laban accuses them of taking their household gods. And they search, but in fact, Rachel hides this household god in the saddle, and she refuses to get off the saddle, saying that she's having her period. So Israelites won't force people to get, most people won't force people to get out of the saddle if it's bloody and so on. So the father doesn't find the household god. And so then Jacob looks to Laban and says, what is my crime? Why do you hunt me down? Why do you accuse me of taking your household god? And he explains how he's worked very hard for him all these years, working through the cold nights, and you've been cheating me so many years, but if God has been helping me, if God doesn't help me, you have cheated me until I have absolutely nothing. And Laban answers, the women are my daughters, you take it up. So they decide that they come to a stalemate situation. So they're going to take some stones, again the stones, and they make a witness of these stones to not harm each other. So he says, may God keep watch between you and me. And they feast, and then they went their separate ways. And then, of course, Jacob then takes an oath and offers a sacrifice, and they spend the night there and they separate. So that's the end of the Laban narrative. Now Jacob still has to go back to his father, and he has to deal with Esau. So on his way back, the angel of God met him, and he said, this is the camp of God, and he calls it Mahanaim. Now Mahana is the Hebrew word for camp, and from here onwards, camp becomes the major theme of the narrative, because there are lots of camps. There's a camp, the divine camp, which Jacob has been living in. All his theology understands the divine camp, and this is the human camp. So Jacob sends messenger in front of him to meet Esau. And he says, this is what you to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I've been saying with Laban, now I'm sending this message I may find favor. So the messenger comes back, and he's afraid. Jacob is very afraid of Esau. And so he separates the people into two camps, into two groups. He thinks, well, at least if he attacks, he'll only get one group and the other group may escape. And then he prays, and he says, I'm unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness to you, your servant. One of the marks of the people who can see the reality of God, to have the Jacob's theologian view of the world, to see that children are given as a blessing by God, to see that God is in control of all things, is that they are humble, because they realize all of it is from God, that he has crossed into this land with nothing and he comes back with everything. So he spent the night there, and he prepares a minha, a tribute. This is the same word Cain is supposed to bring to God, a tribute. And he sends them ahead of them. Oh, I've missed something because, yes, I've missed this bit, sorry. The reason he's so afraid is because the messenger returns and says, Esau is coming with 400 men with you. So, you don't come with 400 men to greet you. The 400 men are not a welcoming committee. The 400 men are people to do battle. So Esau is coming in anger to beat you up, and that's why he's so afraid. And we are supposed to feel this fear of Jacob, because 400 is a very significant number of men. Sorry, I was trying to skip too fast. So he prays to God, and he divides the people into two camps so that they don't all die, and he sends gifts. So he sends 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, etc., to go ahead of him. And one group after another is going to come to his brother, and they're going to say, this is a gift to you, hoping to pacify him. But all of these plans that Jacob makes in reality, the plan to separate the camp, the plan to send out these gifts with his servants, then he does the real thing. He wrestles with God. This is the plans he makes are the camp of human. And now he moves to the camp of God. That night, he took his two wives, his two female servant sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he sent them across the stream, he's left alone, and he wrestles with the man. At daybreak, the man touches socket and breaks him. The man breaks his fight of strength, because Jacob is a strong man. But he fights with this man who breaks his fight of strength by touching his hip. So the battle of strength in verses 24 to 25 becomes a battle of word from 26 to 29, because Jacob now has no more strength. His strongest point has been defeated. The strength that he used to get his wife, to open the rock from the well, to work hard for Laban to get everything he has, that's been broken. All the things that he's gotten from his strength, he's standing ahead to Esau, but that's all been broken by one touch from God. And now he needs the real thing. He's not going to let him go. He's going to get a blessing, and he gets the blessing, and he gets a change of the name, which means God now rules over him, and his name is changed to Israel, which means contend with God or struggles with God. Because you struggle with God and with human. A quote from Quintilian here, he says, ambition is a vice, but it can become the father of virtue. Jacob is a man of great ambition. He collected a lot of livestock. He worked hard. He cheated to steal his birthright. But when ambition is faced towards God, it can become a virtue. And he asked his name, and he called the place Peniel, because he saw the face of God, and his life was there. And he walks out limping, weaker in strength, but actually much stronger in faith. So now we notice when he comes to Esau, who's carried 400 men to attack him, now doesn't attack him. Esau instead meets him and is friendly to him. A little interest, he divided his children, and you see how he divides them. He puts the female servant and children in front, of course, they are less important. Leah and her children, which shouldn't be, because obviously it should be Rachel and her children. Rachel is the second wife, but Rachel is favorite at the rear, and he went on ahead. So he was going to go first, and if Esau re-attacked them, Rachel will be the one that could escape. And he bowed down in front of his brother. He approaches with very much a cultic language, a 7 times bowing. It was almost worshipping language to his brother. And Esau embraced him. So some point with the wrestle with God, Esau changed from this anger with 400 men to this embracing brother. So God has acted in this. The point is God has acted in this. He says, who are these? And he says, the children God has graciously given me. He did not use the word blessed, which is the usual word you will use for having children. And we know he understands that children are God's blessing. He wants to avoid the word pikati because pikati is what he stole from Esau. He doesn't want to bring up the sore point. What are the meaning of all these flocks? To find favor in your eyes. But he rejects it. Esau says, I have plenty. Keep what you want. But he says, no, please accept this. Please accept the present. Now he uses the word blessing, berkati. Do you understand what's gone on here in the negotiation? He offers these gifts of these flocks. Esau rejects it. And Jacob says, this is the present. This is the blessing. This is what I've stolen for you. I'm returning it to you. And therefore, because he's returning the blessing he's stolen, Esau accepts it. Sometimes when we read it, we don't get all this detail. We don't understand the use of the Hebrew words. So Esau goes ahead, but Jacob makes an excuse and says, you know that my children are young, my stocks are young, and I can't follow you. You walk too fast. So you go ahead, and I will come to you in Seir. Okay, that's the promise. Okay, but what does he do? He doesn't go to Seir. Like Abraham before him, he gets hung up. He got stuck at Succoth. And he doesn't go to Seir. And we know what happens to people who get hung up. He arrived in Shechem in Canaan, and instead of going on, he actually paid money to buy a plot of land where he pitched up his tent. And he set an altar there and called Elohi. Now Dinah, this daughter from Leah, had born to Jacob, went out and visited the woman of the land. Now this phrase, the narrator doesn't say very much about it, but it's very problematic because one of the tasks of the patriarch is to supply for the family, especially the daughters. The sons are okay because the sons have an inheritance. The elder son has most of the inheritance, but all the sons have inheritance, but not so the daughters. So the daughters have to survive by marrying to a man. The problem is that he's not found somebody for Dinah to marry because he's not gone to the land. He's not gone back to the land where there are other Israelites. So Dinah can't marry him. He's staying in Canaan where Dinah has nobody to marry, and he doesn't do like Abraham, ask his servant to find somebody. He doesn't do like himself, go to the Arameans to find Laban and find a woman for himself. He doesn't do that for his daughter. And so what is his daughter doing? The daughter is hanging out with the pagan woman of the land. This is trouble to begin. Jacob should be going to Bethel, the gate of God where he first made the promise. Instead, he's dilly-dallying in Succoth, and his daughter is visiting the local woman. Then Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler there, saw her, and he raped her. His heart was drawn to the woman and loved her, and he said to his father, get this girl to be my wife. When Jacob heard the daughter of Dinah has been defiled, his sons were in the fields and his livestock, so he did nothing about it until they came home. Now this nothing about it, I think even for somebody who hasn't read a lot of Genesis, we detect something wrong here. We detect a much harsher admonition than anything the narrator has said about Abraham. He did nothing about it. As we find Jacob becomes old, he becomes less and less active. He becomes more and more uninvolved. He becomes less and less initiative. It's strange. Then Shechem, the father Hamor, went and talked with Jacob. And but when the sons came back, that is Reuben, Simeon, Levi came back, they were outraged that such a thing should be done. But Hamor said to him, I want to marry Dinah to be your wife, to be his wife.
intermarry with us. So the Canaanites, they want them to intermarry. They want to join all together. Your daughters for our daughters. You can take our daughters. You can live among the land. We can make money together. And that's obviously not acceptable in the theology of the land and seed. So Jacob's sons deceitfully reply to them and says, well, we can't do such thing. We need to be circumcised. So they have a circumcision deal. And they lied to them, saying, if you are circumcised, we will give Dinah to be your wives. So this seems good to Hamor and Shechem, who then goes and talks to the other people of the city, and they say, well, let's all get circumcised. So they all get circumcised, and later on, while they were still in pain from the circumcision, Simeon and Levi took their swords and attacked the city, killing every male. They plundered them, seeking their flock and herds. Jacob hears about this, and he says, you've brought trouble onto me, making me obnoxious in the Canaanites, the people living in this land. If they attack us, we'll be destroyed. But they reply, should we have treated our sister like a prostitute? So I think the narrator wants us to know both sides are wrong. Obviously, it is wrong to use God's sacred sign of a covenant as a lie to trick people and to kill them. That's wrong. Obviously, doing nothing about it is also wrong. But the wrong has started long ago. The wrong has started by him being dilly-dallying in Succoth, right? Then God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel and settle there. Build an altar to God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you and purify yourself. This is the narrator's now telling you straight. While they were in Shechem, they've taken up idolatry. They were wicked. That a whole Dinah and the Shechemites episode is an episode of everything going wrong. You have to get rid of the idols. And of course, they're going to get rid of the idols because they are living in fear. They are afraid that the Canaanites and the Perizzites are going to destroy them. So they need God's help now. So they're willing to vow to God in their hour of need. So they got rid of all their idols and they set out. And the fear of God, the terror of God fell on everybody. So God protects them so that they can come to Luz, to Bethel again. And there is where God revealed to him. Now, verse 8 is very interesting. Now, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under an oak outside Bethel, named Alon Bakut. Why is all of a sudden the death of the nurse of Rebekah given? I've told you this already many times. The reason is a slight against Rebekah. Rebekah's death is not recorded. The nurse's death is recorded because the narrator really despises Rebekah. For what? What is the sin of Rebekah? The overruling of the husband, Isaac, the deceitful overruling of the husband, Isaac. I tell you, this Genesis narrator, he has a very different sense of sin than we do. Jacob returns from Paddan Aram. God appeared to him and blessed him. You're named Jacob, you name him Israel. I'm God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number, the same. Be community of nations, okay? Kings will come from you, from your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham, I will give this land to you. Again, the seed, the land, the kingdom is given to him. And there he sits up another stone pillar and he talks with him at Bethel again. So we come back to Bethel. In this cycle, Jacob is restored back to Bethel. We have the death of Rachel and Isaac. We move on from Bethel. There's still some. Rachel begins to give birth and she's having birth, get great pain. Don't despair, you have another son. And she's dying. She named him Ben-Oni, which is son of my pain. The father changed the name to Benjamin, the son of my right hand. And of course, this is a son to replace Joseph. And she died on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And on her tomb, he set a pillar, and this pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Israel pitched his tent beyond Midal Elder, and Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah. Now we're very strange, and Israel heard of it. So we have this one verse, verse 22, right at the end of the story. We have this fact that Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine. Why did Reuben sleep with Bilhah? Is Bilhah particularly pretty? Well, I think it is a overtaking. You see, Jacob is becoming less and less full of initiative, less and less bothering. He's not even taking revenge on the rape of his own daughter. He's less and less powerful. He's less and less leading the family. And so the elder son is trying to dethrone the father. And that's what sleeping with the concubine means. And of course, the classic example, of course, is Absalom, who sleeps with every single concubine of David on the roof for everyone to see, to overthrow the father. So he's trying to overthrow the father. It's a combination of lust and power. For this sin, Reuben loses the leadership. Simeon and Levi also loses the role of leadership from the misuse of circumcision. Jacob does nothing about all of this. Reuben's trying to sleep. Reuben sleeps with Bilhah, and Jacob still does nothing about it. He is the Mr. Do-Nothing father. Dinah, single, getting old daughter, don't provide for her. Put her into Canaanite land, let her walk out with the Shemites. She's raped, we don't do anything about it. And now the two sons go and kill off the other people with circumcision, we don't do anything about it. And now your eldest son is sleeping with your concubine, we still don't do anything about it. Sitting on your hands all the time, Jacob, you're frustrating. If Laban frustrates me from his greedy meanness, Jacob frustrates me in his complete inactivity. The two of them are so frustrating in this passage. I think I've been in Genesis too long. Israel heard of it, he did nothing. The 12 sons, the sons of Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, the sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin, sons of Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali, sons of Leah, Zilpah, Gad, and Asher. I wrote here, Rachel's servant comes first. It shouldn't. It should be Leah, Rachel, Leah, servant, Rachel, servant. But the Rachel servants put ahead of Leah's servant due to the favoritism of Jacob. These were sons born to them. And Jacob came home to his father, Isaac and Mamre, near Kiriath Arah, where Abraham and Isaac stayed. Isaac lived 180 years. He breathed his last and died and gathered his clothes, old and full of years. And his son Esau and Jacob buried him. So that comes to a very long reading. The Esau and his descendants I'm going to do next time, because next time we'll have more time. The next two times we're going to run through the Joseph narrative. The Joseph narrative is difficult to do in one bout. So the several questions, the contrast between Jacob and Esau, how they took different kind of wives, how they got their wives, the contrast between Jacob and Rachel, how they thought people could get pregnant and what they understood by God's protection, how Jacob is aware of God and Rachel is not, how Jacob is aware of God and Esau is completely unaware. Sometimes in our lives, we are like Esau and Rachel, we are unaware of God. Sometimes we are like Jacob. How can we be more aware of God in our lives? Question 2, Jacob struggles with God and changes Esau's hostility. That's the key point of this passage, isn't it? The struggle with God. What hostilities are we facing? How can we gain God's plan and how can we wrestle with God? Jacob does not provide for his daughter. This is frustrating Jacob. He does not respond to the rape. He does not interfere with Reuben's taking his concubine. Sometimes we're not active in love in our life, in our spiritual lives. Where may that be? So these are more sort of spiritual contemplative questions, which I hope you can look at in your breakout group when you come to it. So that's all for me. 3 minutes behind, not too bad, huh?